It was the winter of 1909, and I had been stationed at the St. George Island Lighthouse, Alaska. A lonely, desolate rock in the middle of the Bering Sea, surrounded by the harshest winds and waters I'd ever known. But there was a kind of peace in the isolation, at least at first. The endless waves crashing against the cliffs, the howling wind, the simple life of keeping the light burning. Frank, my partner, had already been at the lighthouse for nearly a year when I arrived. I couldn't have asked for better company. He was the kind of man who could make even the coldest, most miserable day feel lighter. Frank was always cracking jokes, telling wild stories from his days as a sailor, and filling the room with laughter. He had a way of talking that made time pass quickly, even when the weather kept us locked inside for days. He'd talk about places he'd been, Havana, Charleston, New Orleans, painting such vivid pictures of warmth and color that I'd almost forget where we were. "Do you know," Frank said one evening as we were cleaning the lantern, "back in New Orleans, there's this cafe where the owner swears his place is haunted by a pirate. Swear to God. Says the ghost is guarding treasure buried somewhere in the floorboards. I didn't see any treasure when I visited, but I did hear some odd noises." I laughed, shaking my head. "You've got a story for every place, don't you?" "Gotta keep things interesting, don't I?" "Out here, with just you and me, these stories are all we've got," he said, clapping me on the back. For months, life was good. We'd take turns tending to the light, checking the weather reports, and doing our best to keep the salt and damp at bay. We'd talk late into the night, swapping stories over bad coffee and hard biscuits. Frank's laughter echoed through the lighthouse, and for a while, I didn't mind the isolation. It began subtly. I first noticed it during one of the routine checks on the light. Frank, who normally never stopped talking, was quiet. He'd stand at the base of the tower, staring out at the sea, not saying a word. At first, I thought he was just tired. Life on the island wasn't easy. "You all right, Frank?" I asked one day, noticing his unusually quiet demeanor. "Oh, yeah, I'm fine," he said, snapping out of his daze with a grin. "Just thinking, you know. The sea does that to a man sometimes." I nodded, but something about his tone didn't sit right. Frank never struck me as the type to brood over anything. A week later, he began complaining about strange noises. "It's like there's something moving around at night. You hear it?" he asked one morning, a puzzled look on his face. "I haven't heard anything," I replied. "Maybe it's just the wind." But Frank insisted and said, "No, it's more than that. There's a rhythm to it, like footsteps. Like someone's walking around up in the tower. We're supposed to be the only ones here." I dismissed it at first. We were isolated, and isolation can play tricks on the mind. But Frank, always so confident, always so full of life, started to seem genuinely worried. His cheerful demeanor faded, replaced by something else: anxiety. One night, after a particularly rough storm, I woke to the sound of someone moving around the lighthouse. The wind was howling, as it often did, but underneath that, I could hear footsteps coming from the tower. I got up and found Frank sitting in the kitchen, his eyes wide, hands gripping a mug of cold coffee. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he whispered. I nodded, feeling a knot of fear tighten in my gut. Maybe it's just the old place settling, the storm. But Frank wasn't convinced. His hands trembled as he set the mug down. "No, it's not the storm. I know what I heard. Someone's up there," he insisted. We both grabbed lanterns and climbed the stairs to the tower. Every creak and groan of the old wood set my nerves on edge. Frank led the way, his usual swagger gone, replaced by cautious steps. We reached the top, and there was nothing. The room was empty, just as it should be. The light rotated slowly, casting long, sweeping shadows across the walls. "I told you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no one here." Frank didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at the light. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, "We need to keep the light burning. They're watching." I didn't know what he meant, and frankly, I didn't want to ask. Over the next few days, Frank's behavior grew stranger. He muttered to himself, his cheerful stories replaced by fragmented, paranoid ramblings. He barely slept, pacing the halls at all hours, always checking the light, as if he expected it to go out any minute. "I saw them," he said one night, his eyes bloodshot and wide. "Out there, on the rocks. They're waiting." I tried to calm him down, telling him it was just his imagination, the isolation playing tricks on him. But he wouldn't listen. He was convinced something was coming for us. It all came to a head one stormy night. The wind was howling, and the rain lashed against the windows. Frank was pacing again, mumbling under his breath. I was in the kitchen, trying to get some rest when I heard a crash from the tower. I rushed upstairs and found Frank standing by the lantern, his face twisted in a mix of fear and rage. "We have to stop them," he screamed, grabbing a crowbar from the maintenance closet. "Frank, what are you doing?" I shouted, trying to calm him down. "They're coming," he shouted, swinging the crowbar wildly. I barely had time to dodge before he came at me again, his eyes wild with terror. There was no reasoning with him. I grabbed a wrench from the floor and, with a heavy heart, defended myself. We struggled, and in the chaos, I managed to knock the crowbar from his hands. He fell to the floor, panting, his eyes still darting around as if he could see something I couldn't. "Frank?" I said, breathless. "There's no one here." But he didn't answer. He just lay there, staring up at the light, his body shaking, whispering over and over, "Keep the light burning. Keep the light burning." 2 days later, the supply ship arrived. I was alone by then. They found me standing by the lantern, exhausted, trying to keep the light going through the storm. Frank was taken away, raving about the things he'd seen on the rocks. I left Street George Island after that, but sometimes late at night when I close my eyes, I can still hear Frank's voice echoing in my mind. His laughter, his stories, and then that final, frantic whisper, "Keep the light burning."
My name is Yegor, and here, in this moment as I kneel before the blade that will seal my fate, I want to tell how it all began. I was a servant in the castle of Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of all Russia, a man whose cruelty and sensitivity were as vast as the empire he built. I was taken to Ivan's castle in the dead of winter when Russia's snow seems to cover the entire world with a shroud of death. Ivan the Fourth, as he was formerly called, was already a living legend of terror in our country. They said he had killed his own son in a fit of rage, cracking his skull with a scepter that now rested on his throne. He ordered tortures as if they were mere pastimes, watching his enemies be torn apart slowly as he died. His very title, the Terrible, wasn't a mere exaggeration. He was not just a harsh ruler, he was an executioner, a monster, a man who seemed to have made a pact with the devil himself. I knew all this when I was taken to the castle. I knew the stories of men who were boiled alive in oil for questioning his orders, of women thrown to wolves just for disobeying a single glance from the Tsar. But what I didn't know was that within that castle, the stories were darker than anyone could imagine. The castle, built in Moscow, was breathtaking, but not with admiration, with fear. The walls, so thick they muffled the screams of the tortured, seemed to be covered in shadows that danced even without light. Where at the entrance, huge statues of warriors stood watch, their stone eyes seeming to follow your every movement. They said these warriors were souls Ivan had captured in battle and turned into stone through a pact with a sorcerer. From the very first day, something was wrong. I was assigned to maintain the cleanliness and organization of the banquet hall, a hall so vast that it seemed to swallow the light of the torches. There, Tsar Ivan presided over feasts with his most loyal men, the oprichniki, a private guard that terrorized Russia in his name, dressing in black and carrying ferocious dogs with them, along with emblems of dog heads, symbols of loyalty to the Tsar. Their presence made the air heavier, as if the darkness itself took shape. I heard stories from the other servants. They said Ivan bathed in the blood of the enemies he tortured, and that, on nights with a full moon, he wandered the castle corridors, muttering words in ancient language that no one understood. Some said he spoke to the shadows, that he bargained with spirits to maintain his power. There was a legend about a secret room, a room where he made a pact with a spirit called Kashai, an immortal being who, in exchange for human lives, offered forbidden knowledge. I didn't want to believe it, but something was wrong in the castle. Something was breathing. One night, I was called to the Tsar's quarters. The atmosphere was icy, the fire in the hearth seemed incapable of warming the room. Ivan sat before a table, holding an old, stained piece of parchment. His eyes, as cold and merciless as the Russian winter itself, fixed on me. "Yegor," he murmured, and his tone was too soft for the terror it evoked. "You know the price of failure." He smiled, and at that moment, I saw the outlines of something moving in the shadows around him. They weren't guards, they weren't human. Something hissed, and I felt the chill of death on my neck. "Oh, Sarah, I would never fail," I stammered, but he laughed, a low sound, almost amused, as if my plea was that of a child. "We shall see," he said, handing me a small object, a rag doll. "This is you," he continued, and before I could ask what he meant, he squeezed the doll in his hands. I screamed, a searing pain, a crushing in my chest, as if the very air was being sucked from my lungs. I collapsed to my knees, breathless. Ivan released the doll, and the pain stopped. He leaned over me, his eyes boring into mine. "Never disappoint me, Igor." I returned to my quarters that night, but sleep wouldn't come. The legends and whispers became more real. On my pillow, I found strands of hair that weren't mine, and I saw scratch marks on the wood of my door, marks that hadn't been there before. The other servants were changing too, their faces pale, eyes always wide, as if expecting to see something terrible at any moment. "Have you heard about the ghosts?" a collie whispered once, staring blankly ahead. They were the first to fall to Ivan's hands, and now they can't leave. One night, returning from my duties, I saw something I will never forget. In the castle gardens, where statues of saints had been replaced by grotesque stone figures, I saw a woman, pale, with long, tangled hair, dressed in rags. She was crying, but her cry made no sound. When our eyes met, she opened her mouth in a silent scream, and I saw she had no tongue. Terrified, I ran inside, but no matter how hard I tried to forget, I couldn't shake her image from my mind. And then I started dreaming of her. Every night she appeared, each time closer. Her lips formed the words, but no voice emerged. Sweating and panicking, I found the doll Ivan had given me. Now it was stained with dried blood. Then came the fateful day. I was summoned once more to the throne room. There was Ivan, holding my doll, now dyed a deep red. Behind him, the figure of the tongueless woman suspended like a puppet, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You saw her, didn't you?" Ivan asked. I didn't respond. "Oh, Yegor, there are so many things you don't know." He looked at me with a smile of pure delight, and it's too late to learn. I was dragged to the execution hall, and the executioner raised the blade. "Ivan never dies," whispered the man beside me. "He takes the blood of those who perish and starts again always." When the blade finally fell, there was a brief moment of silence, as if time itself had stopped. But I didn't feel death. Instead, I am here, back on the first day, walking through the corridors, the fear growing. I will never leave this place. Maybe Ivan is right. Maybe he never dies. And maybe I will never be free.
My name was Javier Martinez, and if you're listening to this, it means I'm already dead. I was born and raised in Mexico City, a massive metropolis full of life, but also full of shadows. Everyone says that in this city, it's easy to get lost, either through the tempting lights or the empty promises of the streets. I always considered myself above that, a logical, grounded person. I didn't believe in ghost stories, legends, or curses. But about 2 months ago, my confidence was shaken in a way no one could imagine. I worked as a lawyer, specializing in corporate contracts. I gained some fame among the businessmen along Avenida Paseo de la Reforma, known for being able to make any deal happen, no matter how complicated it was. But that talent led me to cross paths with something beyond our world. It was a late night at the lumber market. I don't usually walk around those areas after dark, but I was searching for something specific, an ancient figurine an eccentric client had requested. When I arrived at the shop where it was supposedly located, I found the doors locked and the lights off. I was about to leave, frustrated, when a man, a beggar, appeared out of nowhere. He was dressed in filthy rags, his face weathered by time and suffering, but it was his eyes that froze me. There was something wrong with them, something deep and unsettling that made me hesitate, as if he knew something I didn't. "You're looking for more than just a simple figurine, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice raspy and barely audible. I ignored him, nervous, but he continued, his voice now a whisper heavy with meaning. "You need to know about La Malora. It's an entity you can't ignore." When he mentioned La Malahora, a sense of unease washed over me. I had never heard of it before. The beggar explained that La Malahora is an urban legend that arose in the oldest and darkest areas of Mexico City. According to popular tradition, La Malahora is an evil spirit that appears to those nearing death. The legend says that this entity manifests in the early hours of the morning, especially in deserted and ruined areas, and its presence is always preceded by a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. It's said that La Malahora is not a simple ghost. It's a force of pure evil, a personification of fear and hopelessness. Those who cross its path feel an overwhelming sense of dread, and time seems to slow down around them. It's as if the very darkness around them becomes dense and suffocating, and when the presence finally reveals itself, there's no escape. It latches onto the victim's soul and drags them to a terrible fate. The beggar handed me an address, an old alley near the Plaza de Santo Domingo, and said that was where the oldest pacts were sealed. He claimed that if I was looking for something more powerful than a simple figurine, I should go there. That night I went. I don't know why, perhaps to prove to myself that it was just another story, or maybe because something deeper, a darker curiosity, drove me there. The place was an old, crumbling building, its bricks stained by time and neglect. When I entered, the air grew heavier, as if the darkness itself was alive. The floor creaked with every step, and the silence was suffocating. Inside, I found an old man sitting behind a table with an ancient leather-bound book in front of him. "Are you ready for a real pact, Mr. Martinez?" he asked, without even lifting his head. I should have left right then. I should have walked away from it all. But I stayed. Something inside me, a force I couldn't control, kept me there. I nodded silently. He opened the book, and a stench of decay filled the air. "This pact is not like the others, heavier. La Malahora is not a common spirit. It comes to those willing to pay any price." I laughed again, thinking it was some macabre performance. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back. I signed the contract, sealing my fate. In the weeks that followed, my life seemed to change. My negotiations, which had already been good, became flawless. I made more money than I could spend, and my name echoed among the businessmen as a living miracle. But things quickly began to change. One night, coming home, I saw a strange figure. On the corner of my street, a tall silhouette, cloaked in darkness, watched me. It didn't move, just stood there still. I ignored it, thinking my imagination was playing tricks on me. But in the following nights, the same figure appeared, first distant, then on the opposite sidewalk, until one day I saw it standing at the entrance of my building. That's when I realized the nightmare had begun. From that moment on, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers. La Malahora is coming. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, certain I wasn't alone in the room. I felt an invisible presence, something watching me from the shadows, always at the edge of my vision. There was no rest. I knew something was hunting me. One night, I went to the Zocalo trying to distract myself, but even in the crowd, I saw it. In a window reflection, in the mirror of a car, always there, always watching. Chapultepec, where I used to run, became unbearable. The air there felt dead, as if all nature around me had stopped. I was being watched. Desperate, I returned to the La Merced market looking for the beggar. But he had vanished, as if he'd never existed. The building where I made the pact was in ruins, covered in dust, as if it had been abandoned for decades. And then tonight, it came. La Malahora is not just a legend. It's real, and I felt its presence invade my apartment tonight. I heard its steps, heavy and dragging, and the putrid smell of its approach filled the air. There was no more escape. Its cold hand touched my shoulder, and now, as I write this, I know it's behind me. The price for that pact was my soul. I laughed at the legends, thought I was above them, but now I see they are real. And when it chooses you, there is no escape.
My name is David. I've lived in New York for 10 years now, ever since I moved from the countryside looking for a more intense life. This city gives me everything I ever wanted: energy, anonymity, opportunity. But it also has a cost I thought I was willing to pay. It all started on a regular night. I was heading home from work on Fifth Avenue, passing by the same crowded cafes in the darkened expanse of Central Park. It was a typical day, or so it seemed. But the city, always so full of life, felt different that night. There was something in the air, something heavy. And in my usual impatience, I decided to take a shortcut down a side street to get home faster. It was a narrow street on the Upper West Side, close to the Dakota Building. That corner, where Lennon was shot, always gave me the creeps, but it was a quick route. The further I walked, the more I felt a tension in the air, and then I saw something I shouldn't have seen. A man was arguing with a woman near one of those luxurious doorways. His voice was muffled, but his gestures were aggressive, sharp. I should have just kept walking, but I was tired. My body betrayed me, and I stopped for just a moment watching. It was only a second, but long enough for the man to notice me. He turned his head towards me, his eyes cold and emotionless. It was brief, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I kept walking, pretending nothing had happened, but I could feel that something was off. As I distanced myself, I heard a muffled sound, something like a cut-off scream. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street was already empty. The man and the woman had vanished. Part of me wanted to go back to do something, call the police, but another part, that impatient and selfish part of me, told me to keep walking, and so I did. The following days were strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like something was hanging over me. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. It's not easy living in New York. The city devours you if you let it, and I was determined not to get lost in it. But then, a week later, I saw the news. A woman had been found dead in an apartment close to where I had passed. The descriptions matched. Panic took hold of me. Should I have done something that night? Did that man kill her after I passed? I tried to move on, but guilt began to eat away at my sleep at my days. When I finally decided to go to the police, terrified of being implicated, they barely paid me any attention. They said many had seen a man on that street, and that reports like mine were common. I felt invisible, like the weight of the city had turned against me. I knew I should have said something earlier. That's when the notes started appearing. Small pieces of paper, handwritten, left at my door, in my car, even at my office in Midtown. You saw. You did nothing. She's dead because of you. The first time I found one, I thought it was some sick joke, but they kept coming, always discreet, always threatening. My paranoia grew. I started noticing familiar faces on the subway, on the streets. People who seemed to be following me, watching me. I withdrew from friends, stopped going out at night, and began avoiding the area where the crime happened. I started taking cabs to work, avoiding the crowded subway lines and buses. My nights were filled with insomnia and fear, but the worst was yet to come. One night, after hours of trying not to think about what had happened, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps outside my apartment door in the East Village. I ran to the door and peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. The footsteps, however, continued, echoing down the hallway. A steady thud, like a slow, determined march. I locked myself inside the apartment. I tried convincing myself it was just my worn-out mind, but when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the door, I knew I was in deeper than I thought. I approached the door slowly, the sound of metal against wood making me shiver, and then came a knock. A single, firm knock. I held my breath as I opened the door, expecting the worst, but the hallway was empty. Just another note, stuck to the floor. You're being watched. That morning, after a sleepless night, I decided to leave the city. I took the first flight to Chicago. Hide, disappear, maybe that would save me. But when I arrived at the hotel, I opened my suitcase, and among my clothes, I found another note. There's no point in running. I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know who's after me, who's accusing me. But I feel like I'm losing my mind. What started as an impulsive decision, ignoring something I shouldn't have ignored, has condemned me. I should have done something that night. I should have helped. Now, wherever I go, this guilt follows me, and I don't know how to escape it.
I was never one to believe in stories. I always thought that the local legends, the ones the people of Fernando Daana tell tourists, were just a way to grab attention. But that evening, when the sun was already setting on the horizon and the tide was rising, something changed. I can still smell the salty air, feel the warm sand under my feet, and the silence. That strange, heavy silence that swallowed everything around me. Have you ever felt something like that? The Brazilian island of Fernando Daana is a paradisiacal place. Everyone knows that. But what no one tells you is that when night falls, when the sound of the waves stops being relaxing and turns into something almost threatening, the island shows another side. They told me that some beaches, especially the more isolated ones, hold old stories, secrets that the elders avoid mentioning. And me, curious as I am, thought that exploring one of these beaches would just be another adventure. It was on one of those beaches at Baía do Sancho, a deserted and isolated place where everything began. I had heard a legend, something about voices rising from the water at dusk. They say they're spirits, old fishermen who disappeared at sea. Just a legend, I thought. But that night, something very real happened. I was alone, sitting on the sand, admiring the sea. The sun was slowly setting, casting that orange glow everywhere, until the wind stopped. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but when the wind dies down on an island, the world seems to freeze. I felt suspended, even though my feet were still buried in the sand. That's when I heard it. A voice. No, not just any voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, coming from the water. Come. I thought it was my mind playing tricks. We hear what we want to hear, right? But for some reason, I stood up and started walking toward the sea. I don't know why I did that. My mind was screaming to stop, but my feet kept sinking into the sand, getting closer to the waves. I tried to rationalize it. It was just the sound of the wind, or maybe the water moving over the rocks. But the sound continued, and with each step, it became clearer. Come. With the water already up to my ankles, a chill ran down my spine. There was something in the water. It was impossible to see clearly, but between the movement of the waves, I swear there was a shadow. Too big to be a fish, too low to be a boat. It was a shape, a silhouette, dancing between the waves. Come. The voice whispered again, stronger this time. My body froze, but my mind was in chaos. What was I doing? Why had I come this far? That's when I turned, trying to run back to the shore. That's when I saw footprints. Footprints that weren't mine, because they started from where I was standing and led into the sea. But there was no one there. Every part of me screamed that this didn't make sense. I ran like never before, but the sound of the water, the sound of the waves wouldn't stop. When I finally reached the dry sand, I turned one last time. And then I saw something I'll never forget. The shadow was closer now, right by the water's edge, watching me. It looked like a person, but not completely. The body seemed to merge with the sea, as if it were part of it. And then it raised its hand, slowly and silently, pointing at me. I swallowed hard. My body wanted to collapse, but something, some force, made me take a step back, trying to retreat. It was in that moment that the shadow disappeared into the waves, leaving the sea calm, as if nothing had ever happened. I went back to the village that night, but I couldn't sleep. What was that? A ghost? A hallucination? I tried to talk to some locals the next day, but all I got were wary looks. No one wanted to talk about the beach. No one wanted to talk about the footprints. Now, when I tell this story, I realize sometimes when I'm alone and the sound of the waves surrounds me, I still hear that whisper, as if the sea is calling again. But I've never returned to that beach. Never again.
My name is Jonathan Burke, the boatswain of the Merciless, an English merchant ship that set sail from Cornwall in 1717, crossing the Atlantic to the Caribbean. In those days, the ocean was a lawless territory, full of legends and ghost stories. And though I was a man of reason, I couldn't ignore what was about to unfold. It all started on the 10th day of our journey, as we crossed the Bermuda Triangle. The crew was restless, murmuring about lost ships, sea monsters, and ghost vessels drifting through the fog. I laughed it off. I crossed the Atlantic countless times and didn't fear such sailors' tales. But that night, as the full moon emerged, something changed. A dense fog rose, covering the sea like a cold shroud. One of the men pointed toward the water, and oh, how I wish I hadn't looked. There were lights, small and flickering, like fireflies, moving just below the surface. And then, as if the ocean itself was sighing, a soft, hypnotic chant echoed from the depths. It was a low murmur, but each word seemed to pull at the soul in our chests. Something inside me twisted, as if an invisible hand had clenched my heart. That's when we saw them, bodies, dozens of them, floating on the water. But they weren't dead. No, their eyes were open, staring at us in eternal horror, their mouths moving in unison, as if they were the ones saying that eerie chant. One of the deck boys, Thomas, barely 16, started screaming, pointing to the sea. They want to take us. They're calling us. The captain ordered me to silence him, but before I could act, Thomas leaped into the water, vanishing into the depths in the blink of an eye. That was the first sign that we were doomed, but none of us wanted to believe it. They're calling us, I thought. Whatever was below us wanted our company. That night, the nightmares began. Every crew member woke up screaming, sweating, and sobbing about shadows and monsters crawling from the ocean's depths. I dreamed of a gigantic figure, covered in algae and coral, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness like lanterns. Leviathan, I muttered in my sleep, the name slipping from my lips as if I'd always known it. For sailors and seafaring men, Leviathan was a monstrous creature of the deep, a sea demon that, according to ancient scriptures and legends, ruled the depths and devoured entire ships. Many believed it to be a giant dragon or serpent, capable of sinking vessels with the mere flick of its tail. It was the terror of the waters, a harbinger of death for those who saw it. I woke up with the taste of salt and rust in my mouth, feeling as if something inside me had shifted. The next night, the wind died. The Merciless was adrift, like a corpse floating on the ocean. Our food began to rot, our fresh water turned cloudy and foul, as if the sea itself was contaminating our supplies. The men grew deranged, speaking of a ship with black sails approaching from the horizon. And indeed, I saw it. There was no sign of a crew, just that shadowy vessel and a solitary figure on the deck, cloaked in black that billowed like a living shadow. He raised his hand and pointed at us. My heart froze when I realized the melody had returned. It was as if the ocean itself was calling us to the bottom, to a cold, wet grave. We can't escape this, I muttered to myself as another realization hit me. This was not a call that could be ignored. I tried to convince the captain to abandon the ship. We have lifeboats. We can row to Bermuda, I pleaded. But he looked at me with empty, lifeless eyes, as if he was already on the other side. It's too late, Burke. We're already dead. With one swift motion, he plunged his own sword into his chest, collapsing like a sack of bones. And then something happened. The waters around the Merciless began to boil, and from the depths, hands emerged, human hands, hundreds of them, clinging to the hull, trying to pull us under. My men fought, slashing the hands with knives and swords, but it was futile. The ship began to sink, slowly, as if an invisible force was dragging us down. The first moment of unbearable tension arrived when I glanced at the sea and saw the reflection of a pale-skinned woman with black eyes, smiling at me. She looked like my wife, who had died 3 years ago. "It's not real," I murmured. "It's not her." But when I looked again, she was standing on the deck, walking toward me, the smell of seaweed and salt filling the air. "Deep down, you always knew you'd end up here," she whispered in my ear, caressing my face with cold, scaly fingers. "You belong to the sea, Jonathan." Anger and fear drove me, and I ran to the main deck. With the last lifeboat still intact, I pushed it into the water and threw myself into it, rowing with every ounce of strength I had left. I heard screams, the sound of wood splintering, and then silence. When I looked back, the Merciless was sinking, as if an enormous mouth was devouring it. I thought I was safe, that I had escaped, until I saw The same black-sailed ship that had pursued us, now right in front of me, blocking my path. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the fog, and I felt my lifeboat being pulled closer. When I looked at the water, I saw something moving beneath me, a colossal shadow, slithering like a predator stalking its prey. That's when I realized the truth. It wasn't the crew Leviathan sought. It was me, the captain, the men. They were all just a sacrifice to bring me here, to the heart of the monster. The chants, the floating figures, the rotting bodies I'd seen at the beginning, all led to this moment. And in the last instant, I understood what Leviathan wanted. The boat capsized. Skeletal hands reached up from the water, dragging me down. As the cold water filled my lungs and darkness enveloped me, I felt an unsettling calmness, a bitter acceptance. "You can never escape the sea," I whispered, finally embracing my fate. The last thing I saw before being swallowed by the depths was the glow of Leviathan's yellow eyes, and the chanting began anew. And then, amidst the despair, I realized that my struggle had never stood a chance. I'd been doomed from the start. The sea never forgets, and from now on, I would be just another story told by sailors in the dead of night, a warning to those who dare challenge the deep.
No one knows exactly when the world began to fall apart. It was a series of events: the collapse of the internet, the climatic disasters, the economic meltdown that turned entire countries into wastelands. The great powers fell first, and cities that were once grand became shadows of their former selves. The rest of the world descended into complete chaos, civil wars, famine, plagues, and the planet plunged into an endless night. But Prague was different. The city seemed untouched, as if trapped in a bubble that shielded it from the devastation. At first, I thought it was luck, but luck doesn't last that long. There was something deeper happening, something supernatural. Life in the city felt frozen in time. Shops still opened, the streets were clean, and people smiled as if nothing was wrong. It was like living in a painting, a picture that never aged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, as if a shadow hovered over the city, hidden just out of sight. I decided to investigate, and my questions led me to the Radkini district, the castle district, where they told me about an ancient ritual that supposedly kept the city safe. It was a legend that spoke of an artifact, an old relic called the Head of Brunvik, hidden beneath the Charles Bridge. They said that centuries ago, it had been sealed there by alchemists who wished to protect Prague from the fate that now ravaged the rest of the world. The night I decided to check the legend was cold and silent. The mist from the Voltado River enveloped the Charles Bridge like a veil, and the world seemed still, as if the city itself was watching me. The water was freezing when I plunged my arms in, groping blindly beneath the surface until my fingers touched something hard, cold, and carved, the Head of Brunvik. "Oh, I found it," I murmured, lifting the relic from the water. It was ancient, made of dark stone with facial features that seemed distorted, as if they were in constant motion. Something stirred inside me, a feeling that I should let it go, let it sink back into the river, but it was too late. The moment I pulled it from the water, the sound echoed throughout the city, like the wail of a wounded creature, and then Prague began to die. The lights that illuminated the city flickered and went out, one by one, like stars being swallowed by an endless darkness. The silence gave way to screams, to a panic that spread like wildfire. I ran through the streets in desperation, clutching the Head of Brunvik in my hands, trying to understand what I had done. "Oh, God, what had I done?" I whispered, but there was no answer, only the certainty that something terrible had been unleashed. Chaos consumed Prague within hours. The people, once so peaceful, turned into animals. Stores were looted, broken glass reflected the flames that began to spring up all over the city. I saw families fighting over a loaf of bread, men battling with knives over bottles of water. The beautiful old town square, where tourists once took photos of the famous astronomical clock, was now stained with blood. I ran back to the bridge, desperately searching for a way to undo what I had done, but everything around me was falling apart. The Charles Bridge, which for centuries had been the beating heart of Prague, now looked like a decaying structure, its statues cracked and broken, as if they had been corroded by centuries in mere seconds. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't force the head of Brunswick back into the water. It was as if it was stuck to my hands, weighing a ton. I had to know the truth. I had to understand why this was happening. I ran to the National Library, now overrun by looters and vandals, to find records about the legend. With the remains of a lantern, I found a dust-covered book that described the pact. The head of Brunswick wasn't just an artifact. It was the vessel for the essence of all who had sacrificed their lives to protect the city over the centuries. By removing it, I had released their spirits, and now they were demanding payment. When I left the library, I saw that Prague Castle, which once gleamed like a beacon on the hill, was shrouded in darkness. The Vltava, which once flowed peacefully, was now red like blood, and I could see strange shapes moving beneath the surface, as if the water itself was alive, hungry. I stumbled through the streets, watching people fight, buildings burn, and in the distance, I heard the sound of bells. But they weren't church bells. They were like metallic screams, echoing through the city. I realized then that they were Prague's screams, the city I had condemned with my curiosity. Oh, I had to find a way to fix this. I returned to the Charles Bridge, the wind now biting, carrying with it the whispers of the spirits I had freed. I tried to submerge the head back into the Vltava, but something held me back. A pale hand emerged from the water and wrapped around my wrist, cold and rigid like death itself. "You did this," the voice whispered. The same voice I had heard before, but now twisted, filled with rage and despair. "You broke the pact." The hand pulled me into the river, and I felt the freezing water invade my lungs, burning like ice. As I drowned, I could see the reflection of the city on the surface, a Prague in ruins, engulfed by the chaos I had unleashed. The last lights went out, the screams turned to silence, and I realized with horror that I had been the last to hear the breath of a city that had finally succumbed to the end of the world. I woke up on the riverbank, the head of Brunswick beside me, intact, as if it had never left its resting place. But around me, the city was dead, plunged into a darkness that seemed infinite. Prague, the last bastion of civilization, was now just another ruin swallowed by the same void that had devoured the rest of the world. And me. I was just the final witness to a mistake that could never be undone.
I will never forget that carnival. How could I? I still remember the electrifying atmosphere that took over Rio de Janeiro. The street parades, the vibrant costumes, and the pounding rhythms filled the hearts of the revelers. But behind the euphoria, a growing fear lingered, a silent shadow creeping through the alleys, favelas, and avenues. That was the year of the fever of fire, as they called it, a mysterious disease spreading like wildfire throughout the city. It started with a mild fever, but within hours, the person's skin began to burn as if they were being scorched from the inside out. The infected developed red and yellow patches, and their flesh seemed to boil beneath their skin. The end was always tragic. The victims succumbed to convulsions of pain, their screams echoing through the streets like a warning of impending doom. There was no cure, only fear and chaos. It was in this dark setting that I received an unusual invitation. A party, the note said, a masquerade ball in one of Rio de Janeiro's old mansions, high above Santa Teresa. It promised to be an unforgettable night, an escape from the horror that had gripped the city. The host was an eccentric millionaire, known for his fortune, but little else was known about him. Perhaps that was what drew me in, the promise of escaping, even for just one night, from the suffocating reality. The mansion was a relic of the past, a grand structure with marble staircases and crystal chandeliers. Guests arrived in groups, all masked, each costume more extravagant than the last. I, dressed as a harlequin, with a gold and black mask, entered the gates with a mix of anxiety and excitement. Inside, the atmosphere was pure decadence and luxury. The main hall where the party began was dominated by shades of red and gold. The walls, draped in velvet curtains, seemed to bleed in the candlelight. A large stage occupied the centre, where a samba school's drum corps played relentlessly, creating a hypnotic beat that mingled with the laughter and whispers of the guests. The masks, with their hollow stares, reflected the light, creating a sea of indistinct faces. Then, I noticed something peculiar. There were several interconnected rooms, each decorated in a predominant colour. The first room, where everyone danced, was the red room. Next to it was a blue room, where the lights were cold and the shadows stretched along the walls. The floor was covered in a thick mist that coiled around the dancers' legs like serpents. The next room was green, with tropical plants hanging from the ceiling, the air thick with a sweet, cloying scent. The environment felt alive, as though nature itself was watching every move. There was also a yellow room, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast a golden glow on everything. There, guests laughed and toasted with champagne, their faces distorted by the blinding light. Further along, I found the white room, pure and silent, where laughter was muffled by translucent curtains, and the sound of drums seemed distant, as if from another world. Finally, I reached the last room, a black room. The darkness was almost total, except for a single beam of blue light that cut through the air like a blade. The walls were covered with broken mirrors, reflecting distorted images of the guests. The floor, deep black, seemed to absorb both light and life. As I explored the mansion, something began to change. A nervous murmur spread through the crowd. A new figure appeared, dressed in black, its mask a grotesque representation of a human face, with hollow eyes and an expression of agony. The figure moved slowly, and wherever it went, the sound diminished, laughter ceased, and looks of fear and disgust surfaced. I approached, curious, but as the figure advanced, something inside me began to scream for me to flee. A primal terror overtook me. The other guests, now paralyzed, seemed to feel the same. The figure moved toward the black room, and one by one, the lights in the other rooms began to go out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was drawn to the black room as if an invisible force was pulling me. When the figure finally entered the room, the last beam of light disappeared, and the sound of music ceased entirely. All that remained was the sound of heavy breathing and the rustle of clothes as the figure passed through the crowd. Suddenly, the figure's mask fell, revealing what was underneath. It wasn't a human face. It was something indescribable, a face that seemed to melt, with exposed flesh and eyes that burned with feverish light. An unbearable heat filled the room, and I felt the fever of fire begin to consume my body. The terror was absolute. There was nowhere to run, no escape. The fever spread like fire among the guests, and within minutes, the room was filled with screams of agony. I saw people collapsing to the floor, convulsing, their masks melting along with their skin. I was among the last to fall. I felt my body burn, my vision fade, but before everything ended, I realized something even more terrifying. The masked figure was laughing, a deep, guttural laugh that echoed in my mind as everything went black. Now, from beyond, I watched Rio de Janeiro continue the party, oblivious to what happened that night. The fever of fire spread, consuming everything in its path. But no one speaks of the ball, of what really happened. Perhaps it's better that way. Perhaps it's better that no one knows that death came to the carnival that night and it wore a mask. But I know. I will always know. And from where I am, I still hear that laugh, reminding me that in the end we all wear masks, and sometimes they fall, revealing what lies beneath each of us.
It all began a few months ago, But I only realized what was truly happening recently. Something changed, something subtle, almost imperceptible, at first. Like a slight discomfort in the back of my neck. A sensation you can't immediately identify, but that intensifies over time until it can no longer be ignored. I was being watched. There was no doubt about it. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just fatigue, stress. God knows that life at the top of a major company takes its toll. But the more I tried to push the idea away, the more it grew. Like a tumor, the feeling took root in my mind, turning every shadow, every muffled sound, into a potential spy. I am a middle-aged man, and I've always been very successful. 25 years in the financial market, I built an empire. My luxurious penthouse in Manhattan is proof of that. Glass walls that open to a panoramic view of the city, modern designer furniture, artworks by renowned artists. Everything within my reach, all carefully earned. But with success come enemies. That has always been an inescapable fact, especially when you're at the top. Competitors are always lurking, waiting for the slightest weakness. Lately, it seems like there's more than just the usual market competition. I started working more from home because the office stifled me. All those people, colleagues, employees, seemed so suspicious. Every glance was furtive, every gesture calculated. And of course, with the pandemic, working from home became the norm, and I ended up isolating myself even more. I fired one employee here, dismissed another there, until only I remained in this vast penthouse. Thought it would bring me peace, but the effect was the opposite. The more I distanced myself from others, the more paranoid I became. I started to notice things, small details that had previously escaped me, like the smell of cigarettes that suddenly filled my study, even though I quit the habit 10 years ago. Or the constant feeling of being watched, even in my most intimate moments. There were nights when I was certain someone was lurking, watching me from outside the glass windows. But who could be there? I was on the 45th floor, for God's sake. And yet, the feeling wouldn't leave me. Could one of my former employees be plotting something against me? Could they be in cahoots with a competitor? Or worse, with a family member? Ah, my family. Long history of disagreements and inheritance battles. My siblings have always coveted what I had, always felt inferior, slighted. And now, could it be them, watching me, trying to find a way to bring me down? No, this is madness, I whispered to myself. But deep down, I knew this idea had its roots in reality. No one gets to where I am without leaving a trail of resentment and enemies. Maybe it was one of those competitors. Perhaps someone was gathering information to incriminate me, or worse. The nights became unbearable. The silence, once a blessing after chaotic days, was now filled with imaginary whispers, ghostly creaks in the walls as if the building's very structure were conspiring against me. I began to avoid mirrors, not because I feared my reflection, but because, whenever I approached, I had the strange sensation that something moved behind me, something I could never quite identify. A reflection, that wasn't mine. What tormented me most were the phone calls. The phone would ring late at night, and when I answered, all I could hear was slow, heavy breathing on the other end. No matter how many times I changed my number, the calls always returned, always that sound. Who are you? What do you want? I screamed, but only silence answered. In the end, I took the phone off the hook and left it that way. Better than facing that infernal mystery again and again. I began to think there might be hidden cameras around the house. I searched every room, checked every inch of the walls and furniture, looking for some sign, some clue that I was being watched. Checked the air ducts, inspected the darkest corners, but I found nothing. Nothing concrete, at least. Just that persistent feeling that something was wrong. I could feel my body deteriorating little by little. I was losing weight, my eyes were sunken, and my skin, God, it seemed like I aged years in just a few weeks. The dreams, those horrible dreams. I dreamed of shadows in my home, sneaking through the halls, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I woke up sweating, heart racing, but the sensation of being watched remained. I remember one particular night. It was raining heavily outside, thunder echoing through the enormous windows of the living room, and I was sitting in my black leather armchair, staring into the void. I was convinced someone was watching me from outside, a shadow, maybe a man, standing on the balcony. But how? How could someone be out there on the 45th floor? My mind told me it was impossible, but my heart was gripped with terror. I felt the need to check. I walked to the glass door carefully, trying not to make a sound. When I looked outside, I saw nothing, just the torrential rain pouring down the glass. Sighed in relief, but my body didn't relax. Deep down, I knew something was out there, lurking, even if I couldn't see it. But the worst came the next morning. I had barely slept, as usual, but when I woke up, found wet footprints on the floor, marked by boots. The same ones I saw in my dream. Footprints in my living room near the balcony. Footprints of someone who could never, ever have been there. My body trembled, panic overtook me. Someone had been here. How? I had checked the penthouse top to bottom. There are no entrances that aren't locked, but the footprints, they were there, etched into the polished floor. Panic set in. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. I started to think this was the end, that maybe some enemy was finally ready to make their final move. I looked around, noticing the emptiness of the penthouse. Everything I had built, all the luxury, all the power, none of it mattered now. I was alone, haunted by ghosts of my own creation, ghosts from a life of betrayal, selfishness, rivalries. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadow at my back seemed to grow. Finally, I was on the verge of sleep when I heard a muffled sound coming from the hallway. Footsteps. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I waited in silence, but the noise stopped. Everything was quiet again. Was I going crazy? Got up and walked to the bedroom door, opening it slowly. The hallway was dark and appeared empty, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slowly approaching. A shiver ran down my spine. I quickly closed the door and locked it, my whole body trembling. Tried to convince myself that it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But I knew something was wrong. Something was there. Then, suddenly, the apartment lights went out. A total blackout. The only sound left was the ticking of a clock, the cuckoo clock, a family heirloom, which I had placed in the corner of the living room and rarely paid attention to. The sound echoed in the darkness as if it were a warning. My heart was beating so hard that I could swear someone, or something, was listening. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I knew I was no longer alone. I groped in the dark, searching for something I could use as a weapon. I found an iron bar that was part of a piece of furniture. My instincts were screaming at me to run, to flee, but a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. Who was he? What was he doing here? Then I heard a noise, an almost imperceptible whisper coming from the next room, my bedroom. Trembling, I approached the half-open door. The faint light coming from the window dimly illuminated the room's interior. I could see a shadow moving inside, and fear paralyzed me. Then, a familiar voice whispered my name. How could this be? That voice. It was mine. With growing dread, I pushed the door open. Inside the bedroom, beside the bed, I saw the figure of a man with his back to me. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid. He was standing, staring at the mirror. As I approached, he slowly turned, revealing a face that made me freeze. It was me. Not a copy, not an illusion, but me, flesh and bone, smiling wickedly, with eyes that didn't seem human. Without warning, he lunged toward me, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying in bed, drenched in cold sweat. The lights were on, the clock read 11:47 p.m., exactly as before. I stood up, dazed, and rushed to the balcony. Everything was silent, no figure, no sign that anyone had been there. But when I turned, something in the mirror caught my eye. There was a dark stain on the glass, something that hadn't been there before. And then, I noticed something that made me shudder. The reflection in the mirror wasn't synchronized with me. It was watching me, and at that moment, I understood that I would never be alone in that penthouse again.